Europe is starting to rearm itself, and things are getting very interesting. Countries throughout the continent are deciding to spend more than ever on defense and arms procurement. This in turn has caused ripples of activity throughout the world's defense contractors and arms manufacturers. And numerous NATO member countries are tackling the question recently, can or even should we continue to obtain our weapons and security from the United States or not? It seems that in the space of quite literally just a few months, the global defense status quo has been completely upended. But how did this happen? Well, in order to explain that, let's first zoom out a bit for some context first.
Now, before we continue, I just want to remind everyone that Mother's Day is coming up, and so that is something that you should be concerned about. Now, luckily, I've never actually had to worry because I already gave my mother the perfect gift, myself. Mom, mommy, mom. Of course, I have noticed that hasn't really been as effective of late. So I got her a granddaughter.
Grandma, 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 grandma.
Of course, I understand that it can really be time-consuming as well as expensive to kind of tune the both of us out, but luckily, that's where Raycon now comes in. With 32 hours of battery life as well as noise cancellation, this is something that you normally don't get at a price point that you can get for Raycon. Mom,
Grandma,
Mama,
grandma,
Mom,
grandma,
Mommy.
grandma.
Honestly, make sure to go ahead and get your mother the perfect Mother's Day gift and help tuning out all the things in life that are annoying. Not you, but everything else. Go to buyraycon.com and get yourself a set of these. Mom,
Grandma,
Mama,
grandma,
Mom,
grandma,
Mommy.
grandma.
In the year 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, was created. Now, initially, this was formed to stop the spread of communism, and the organization initially consisted of just 12 members. By now, though, it consists of 32 countries. That being said, one thing has been constant since the beginning, though. If one partner was attacked, the others would help to defend it. This is something that was outlined very clearly in Article 5 of the NATO Treaty. Of course, that all being said, everyone knew from the very beginning that the big player who was going to be, if you will, participating the most and footing most of the bill was expected to be the United States. Since those early post-war days, the United States has been providing both protection for allied nations against their enemies, as well as selling them military hardware and arms with which to defend themselves. While European defense contractors do exist, of course they exist, and they do produce some of the best arms and munition systems in the world, which I've actually made a number of fun shorts on, the US has been, by and large, Europe's #1 security source for pretty much anything military related. This is a relationship that would last even through the disintegration of Western Europe's greatest historic enemy, the Soviet Union, the thing that was responsible for the creation of NATO in the first place. The thing is, though, even though this relationship is something that was going to last, it doesn't necessarily mean that it was going to be a fair or good thing. In fact, heading into the 21st century and coinciding with the rise of the global war on terror, most European countries continued to be somewhat laid back with their approach on arms procurement and production. After all, they didn't have a great immediate enemy right on their border. Instead of spending the money on military matters, why not just reinvest all of that money into social services, developing their own economy and building a social welfare net that is able to support their population and make them happier? That seems like something that if you have a guaranteed security force backing you, would be a smart decision. It's not a fair one in the case of the United States, and me saying that is not a political statement from some right-wing blog. Even President Barack Obama would warn his European counterparts that they were being complacent when it came to their own defense spending, and that if they didn't become more proactive in that regard, then they would remain reliant on the US for their defense needs. So, again, it can't really be said that this growth in the European sector that we're seeing right now is entirely unanticipated. But what is surprising is just how much recently it has accelerated. And let me explain that further. Since his first term in office in 2017, President Donald Trump has been pretty vocal, we should say the least, with his criticism of the European NATO partner countries and their contributions to the overall NATO mission. And again, to be fair, he has a pretty good point here. At that point in time, the US was paying 22% of the operating costs of NATO. Since then, that figure has dropped some after 2019 and an agreement that today the US and Germany both contribute 16% of the costs, while the UK pays 11%, which is a very big difference, but that still means that the overall lion's share is paid by just 3 countries. Let me remind you at this point that there are 32 member countries inside of NATO. Another point of contention that has been brought up repeatedly then is not just the overall contribution to NATO itself, but specifically the clause in the NATO treaty that stipulates that member countries must spend at least 2% of their GDP on defense. In 2014, the number of countries that actually hit that 2% requirement was 3. That being out of all the member countries, 3 hit it. Yes, that is not a good thing at all. Yet regardless of whether or not they kept to the rules of the treaty or not, the United States would continue to arm them, to train them, and sell them equipment regardless of whether they were paying their fair share or not. In fact, the US would complain so much about this during the first Trump term that by the end of 2024, 23 out of the 32 member states would actually hit the 2% spending goal. And that is something that admittedly can be considered quite a good thing to have happened under President Trump's first term in office. Of course, that being said, there are going to be downsides to this still. And now this year marks rapid change for Europe, and it would seem like the Trump administration's recent actions are to thank for this as well. In February, the US would oppose a European drafted resolution condemning Moscow's action and supporting Ukraine's territorial integrity. This means that the US was voting the same way as Russia and other authoritarian countries, including North Korea and Belarus, at the UN General Assembly in New York. Then, the US drafted and voted for a resolution at the UN Security Council which called for an end to the conflict but contained no criticism of Russia. No inclusion of concessions or responsibility for the conflict in the first place, nothing, no admission of guilt, nada. European diplomats would table a more detailed version of the resolution's text, blaming Russia for its full-scale invasion and supporting Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Then, when it came time to vote on it, the UN General Assembly eventually passed the US resolution, but only after it was amended to include language supporting Ukraine, which led to the US abstaining to vote for its own resolution in the first place because it was critical of Russia. Of course, me saying that right now is going to sound incredibly negative, and I fully understand that, but with the majority of people online and what you see in the headlines is not really giving you the full picture of what has been going on, the distribution of funds, how unfair things are for certain groups, and overall what a realistic ending for a conflict could be, depending upon how the war actually goes and whether or not funding could dry up. The reality is, things are significantly more complicated than people give it credit for, but to many online, it's simply a black or white issue. It's also not one that is necessarily divided just along party lines. Republican U.S. Senator John Curtis would put out on X that he was deeply troubled by the vote, which put us on the same side as Russia and North Korea. These are not our friends. This posture is a dramatic shift from American ideals of freedom and democracy. This, in turn, would coincide with President Trump's decision to cut off U.S. funding to Ukraine, which presented a huge problem for many leaders of countries throughout NATO, as well as for leaders of countries allied to the United States. Why would that be? Well, specifically because of the countries involved in the conflict. You see, my friends, at the time of Ukraine's independence from the Soviet Union in 1991, Ukraine held the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world, including an estimated 1,900 strategic warheads, 176 intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs, and 44 strategic bombers. By 1996, however, Ukraine had returned all of its nuclear warheads to Russia in exchange for economic aid and security assurances. Part of those security assurances were outlined in the 1994 Budapest Memorandum regarding Ukraine, and in this document, the United States, the UK, and the Russian Federation all agreed on certain conditions, including that they would respect the independence, sovereignty, and borders of Ukraine. At this time, many promises were made about coming to the aid of Ukrainians should Russia ever invade, but many people thought that this was very unlikely at the time. And besides, if that war was to ever actually happen, then we could simply just send them weapons and money and that sort of thing. Now, of course, if you look at recent history, Russia would violate this agreement in 2014 with their annexation of Crimea. But it's kind of odd to be able to say that the US broke their word here as well when the Trump administration recently stopped sending money to Ukraine. However, it's important, though, at this point to make the distinction between an assurance or an agreement and a treaty. The Budapest Memorandum was an agreement, but that does not carry the weight of law. It's simply a statement that the countries involved made, and if it had been a treaty that the countries had signed, then when the Trump administration cut off funding and weapons to Ukraine, it would have been against the law and breaking the treaty. But since it was simply an agreement, the very next president and his administration could just have easily turned around and ignored the agreement. So in essence, the difference here is like if you bought something on monthly installments and then you had the choice of a promise to pay cash every month, or an auto bill directly deducted from your account. One of those options can be easily broken without immediate consequences. The other, not really so much. To exemplify the difference more clearly, because the NATO treaty is a treaty, if Russia invaded, like let's say Poland, then the US would be bound by law to respond. And I bet at this point you're probably thinking like, okay, well, why does it matter, Stack? Well, that's where we get to the part that could matter big time in the long term. You see, for the past few decades, most of the countries in Europe, nearly all the NATO countries, for example, have been receiving most of their weapons and spending most of their defense budgets, minuscule as that was, on arms from the United States. Sure, yeah, they would buy from each other on occasion, but the lion's share of defense spending payments went to companies from the US because they represented the largest power that would come into play should a war occur. They had the biggest and best military forces for so long that the European allies just got used to depending upon the US to bail them out should war actually occur. This was the way of things, the status quo. Because of all this, the United States military-industrial complex, all those companies that go and build the tanks, the guns, the bombs, the bullets, everything, they would grow to become over 10 times larger and more profitable than that of Europe. By the time the second Trump administration came into power, many leaders were growing tired of this arrangement. This can be proven by a brief snippet of the Signalgate leaked conversations where Vice President J.D. Vance would comment, and I quote, "I just hate bailing out Europe again," end quote. Defense Secretary Pete Hesketh would then reply, quote, "I fully share your loathing of European freeloading. It's pathetic," end quote. Which, yeah, it's a pretty harsh statement, but that is the sentiment that has been built up over time. All of these things combined, the resolutions, the cutting of funding, the leaked conversations, they all implied that American leadership was tired of supporting European peace. It was time for these European countries to reassess their approach to national and regional defense. And in March of 2025, the European Commission would release its White Paper for European Defense Readiness 2030. This single document would serve to be the single largest turning point in defense spending and geopolitical momentum since the Truman Doctrine was formulated, stating that wherever democracy was threatened, the United States had a right to be involved. And let me explain in greater detail about why that is the case. You see, my friends, a white paper provides answers and planning of resources for specific policies such as foreign policy or defense policy. In this case, right from the introduction, the document refers to the deteriorating context in which it is being written. Europe is in danger on its own territory because of the Russian threat to the east, described as fundamental and long-term. The many other types of threats it faces as well, hybrid, terrorism, dependence on raw materials, geographical threats in its Middle Eastern and African neighborhoods, and also China, and also because of a future disinvestment by the US from the security of the European continent. Europeans therefore need to anticipate collective defense by themselves in the years to come. The white paper goes on to identify 4 priorities. The first is filling capability gaps. According to the paper, there are 7 priority capability areas in which to improve: air and missile defense, artillery systems, ammunitions and missiles, drones and anti-drone systems, military mobility, cyber warfare, and critical infrastructure protection. The second is support for Ukraine and the use of the porcupine strategy. The porcupine strategy entails the belief that Ukraine represents the front line of European defense and security. This also includes supporting Ukraine to rebuild after a ceasefire or peace agreement, and incorporating the Ukrainian defense industry into the European one, which would benefit both parties as the Ukrainians have the most up-to-date experience from the front line, and this would strengthen the militaries of European allies. As a side note, this very last point is another reason why some of the defense industry have claimed that cutting off funding to Ukraine is a bad idea. The cost of helping Ukraine financially was being offset by getting the most up-to-date intelligence and experience with modern warfare and drones in battle that you can find anywhere on the planet right now. Like you are quite literally at that point paying for a real-life simulation, just with, unfortunately, actually people going and dying, which is not a pleasant thought to have. Do you want to know how a war against China might be fought? Well, look at Ukraine. Lots of drones would be involved. And by this point, the world's largest manufacturer of custom drones in the world is Ukraine. They went into the best drone manufacturers in the world and made deals to buy in bulk. Now they have warehouses throughout Ukraine pumping out drones by the hundreds daily. So when it comes to drone warfare and production, the Ukrainians are literally on the cutting edge worldwide. By not funding them anymore, the US loses access to that experience going forward. Anyway, back to the white paper. Prioritizing Ukraine in the terms of the white paper means providing large caliber artillery ammunition, with a target of 2 million rounds in 2025 alone, deployment of air defense systems, enhanced drone capabilities, and continued collaborative military trading. The third priority mentioned in the white paper is to strengthen the European defense industry so that it can produce more, faster, and in a collaborative way to ensure predictability for manufacturers over the long term. This stems from a new lack of trust in consistent American support going forward, and includes a proposal to build a true EU-wide market for defense equipment and creating strategic reserves. The fourth part specifically concerns defense spending, which needs to be increased rapidly. This includes various methods for funding defense spending that adds up to 800 billion euros made available to member states over the next 5 years. The document also sets out areas of work on military mobility, a crucial issue when it comes to rapidly transporting equipment and troops from one end of Europe to the other in the event of crisis. The EU has identified 4 distribution avenues of opportunity: rail, road, sea, and air, and 500 hotspot projects to be upgraded urgently. In terms of infrastructure, the EU also recognizes the need to strengthen the borders with Russia and Belarus with the implementation of the Eastern Border Shield. The paper proposes setting aside billions of euros for building this infrastructure. Now, considering everything that I've talked about here, this has largely focused specifically on Europe itself and what Europe can do for itself. The white paper includes only 3 mentions of the United States, one referring to a demand that Europe take more responsibility for its own defense, one about the transatlantic ally turning its focus away from Europe to other regions of the world, and one about the country reducing its historical role as a primary security guarantor. Since the year 2014, countries such as Hungary, the Czech Republic, Poland, Denmark, North Macedonia, Slovakia, and Sweden have doubled their defense expenditures, while Luxembourg, Latvia, Lithuania have actually tripled their defense spending. Germany, the Netherlands, Estonia, Romania, Bulgaria, and Finland have also nearly doubled their defense budgets. In many cases, this hasn't been enough yet, but the money is starting to trickle in. Which actually, on that note, speaking of Germany, they recently voted to ease restrictions on government spending when it came to defense, with an overwhelming majority of votes. They would free up over 500 billion euros for military spending, as well as over 500 billion euros for infrastructure improvements, by not having those expenses be counted as part of the national debt, which has very strict regulations and restrictions, mind you, to prevent runaway spending. That is actually fascinating to mention here right now, because I did already talk about that briefly when it came to the economic crisis that Germany is facing or is set to face and their whole debt issue. If you want to go watch that video, you definitely should. But they've also done more things. They've also freed all money donated to Ukraine defense from being counted as part of the national debt. This is seen as historic, since this means that they'll be able to spend a large portion of their GDP on defense spending than, well, pretty much than they have ever been able to since 1945. Me saying that, yeah, I can hear right now some Wereaboo going and singing Erica already in the background, and the lyrics I'm sure are going to pop up in the comment section. Either way, in one swift move, the very risk-averse Germans would shed the stigma of heavy defense spending that they've shouldered since 1945, but also set themselves up to be leaders in the new, more independent from the US version of the EU that we are starting to see develop. Other EU countries are making their own moves too. This includes how each member state looks at certain topics like conscription, where the Russian army consists of roughly 1.3 million troops, of which 700,000 are currently in Ukraine, and the EU countries currently field around 1.5 million troops, which puts the EU at a vast manpower disadvantage. I know that sounds counterintuitive since they outnumber the Russians, but remember, this is 1.5 million soldiers under 24 different rank and command structures, and just as many languages, whereas the Russians are under 1 rank, 1 command structure, 1 language. And let me tell you right now, historically, that makes a huge operational difference when it comes to actually accomplishing objectives. Remember this, that with the Cold War over, many EU countries significantly reduced their military personnel, since conscription was abolished in many of them. For example, France would end conscription in 1997, Germany would end it in 2011, etc. However, in response to the growing Russian threat, countries like Latvia and Lithuania have reinstated conscription in recent years. To strengthen European armies, Latvia's president, Edgars Rinkevics, which I'm probably butchering the pronunciation of in the first place, would recently say that Europe should absolutely introduce conscription, an idea backed by Estonia, but also it is something that for the everyday average European person who has not had to really live with it for decades, it's not something that is very popular. Several European countries still do have compulsory conscription, ranging from 4 months in Denmark to 19 months in Norway. Austria, Finland, and Sweden require 6 to 12 months, while Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania mandate around 9 to 11 months. Some are longer, like in the case of Greece and Cyprus, which have longer terms of 12 to 15 and 15 months respectively, but generally speaking, that is typically what you see. The issue then of how to supply the manpower needed to stand up to any possible Russian threat, that is going to be a very interesting problem to watch and see how the various different EU member states approach it. As Andreas Kiblis, the European Commissioner for Defense and Space, would say, quote, "The priority for Europe must now be on implementing the proposed plan," end quote. Yes, according to Kiblis, Europe has 3 areas to tackle: massive production of what the continent already makes, such as conventional ammunition, development of strategic enablers, such as air-to-air refueling capabilities, and space-based intelligence, and defense products of common European interest, such as air defense systems. Regardless of what they do, the EU member states seem to be committed to doing it while relying on the United States as little as possible, but whether or not that is actually how it's going to play out, we don't really know. Like, let's be clear here. There are some things that Europe will simply have no other option but to acquire from the United States for the foreseeable future. That is just reality. This is simply because the vast billions more that the United States has invested in defense production, in infrastructure, as well as research and development, and the head start that they have had of literally decades in some aspects is a huge advantage. Europe is playing a massive game of catch-up currently, but potentially within the next 5 to 10 years, there could be a very different outlook when it comes to Europe's reliance on the US military-industrial complex. You can guarantee that, of course, looking at all that, we will continue to update you on the state of these developments as they occur, and who knows what kinds of tanks, planes, missiles, or any other devices we'll be able to analyze and look at here. That would be a series of fascinating videos. Either way, my friends, that is going to be the end of things here today. Thank you all for watching. I really appreciate it. Let me know in the comment section below what it is that we should cover next, and I will see you all here next time. Goodbye, everyone, and best of luck.